welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm really happy to introduce PhebeAnn Wolframe-Smith. PhebeAnn is a health equity specialist in the Provincial System Support Program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. They hold a PhD in English and Cultural Studies from McMaster, and prior to their current position, they worked in research administration at Lakehead University. So today, PhebeAnn is going to discuss the transition from the completion of their PhD in 2013 to their current position and the experiences inside and outside of academia that led them to working in healthcare. So I will turn it over to you, PhebeAnn. I know we're all excited to hear from you. And everybody just jump in, keep it informal, raise a hand or put a question in the chat, and I will go off camera now.
Thank you so much, Beth. Hopefully my voice holds today. It's been a little in and out because of the forest fires in the area where I am. It's been really smoky. So I also wanted to start today with just a land acknowledgement from where I'm sitting. I'm humbled to have spent the majority of my life here as an uninvited guest on the territory of the Anishinaabe people of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. You know, I've spent most of my life on these incredible lands, and they give me a deep sense of home, and just want to express gratitude to the stewards of this land and my commitment to continuing to support land sovereignty efforts here and across Turtle Island. I'm going to keep things fairly informal today. I don't even have a PowerPoint, believe it or not. But I'm going to kind of follow, you know, the format that was suggested to me. I'll just pop that in the chat so you know where we're driving the bus. I'll talk a bit about my current job, how I got here, so kind of the career path, my educational journey / educational background, and what are the PhD skills that I'm using where I am now. The other thing that I will pop in the chat is kind of a high level overview of my career path. If this is helpful for you to follow, you can, you know, copy it out of the chat or whatever works for you. So this is sort of the timeline that I'm going to go through a little bit, if text is helpful to help ground you. So right now, as Beth mentioned, I work as, my title is Health Equity Specialist, and I work for CAMH, which stands for Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is the largest mental health teaching and research hospital in Canada. It's based in Toronto. However, the program that I work under, the Provincial System Support Program, also known as PSSP, because we love acronyms in healthcare even more than we love them in academia. So PSSP has staff across Ontario, and I live in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and work 100% remotely. So PSSP, this program that I work as part of, is sort of a funny program. It has been it used to be a bunch of different organizations, but you know, has been part of CAMH since 1998. So we're what is called an intermediary organization, basically a bridge between different partner organizations in the mental health and addiction sector, providing support to implementation of new mental health and addictions initiatives. Our primary funder is the Ontario Mental Health and Addiction Centre of Excellence, which oversees mental health care on behalf of Ontario Health. I say all of this because it's kind of a little bit of a confusing place, so, and it's important kind of context for the job that I do. Because of our close ties with this Centre of Excellence, that's under the Ontario government, in many ways, my role is similar to a government job with many of the same benefits and challenges. So for example, we're subject to the same funding cycles and kind of fluctuations in priorities depending on shifts in the sitting government. My role as part of the equity and engagement team at PSSP involves helping to embed health equity strategy and practice into both our internal operations as a program, as well as, and this is primarily what I do in my role, is externally into programs that we're working with the Center of Excellence to implement across the province. So as an example, one of those programs is the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program, which is a free CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy program that is available across the province. So that's one of the programs that I've worked to help support the setup of, and some health equity pieces in relation to. So in practice, what does this look like on a day-to-day basis? So it can be like facilitating community consultations through focus groups, interviews, surveys. It can be doing literature reviews. It can be creating toolkits and resources based on those literature reviews and those consultations related to health equity. It can be developing and facilitating health equity trainings. There's also a coaching component to my role. Actually, initially my title was health equity coach, but it was changed to health equity specialist because I actually don't do a ton of coaching, but I do some. So that's sort of like helping colleagues and external partners to think through their health equity practices and like sort of what are they doing now, what could they be doing differently, what are some resources they could access, that sort of thing. And also I, help to create health equity implementation frameworks and action plans. So these are sort of like who, what, when, how are they going to do different action items related to health equity. So in a nutshell, if I can break it down more simply, because it's really hard to explain this without jargon, I tell people how to improve access to and experience of mental health and substance use services based on research and lived experience evidence. So I hope that explains it a bit, what I do now. So a question I get a lot is like, how the heck did someone with a PhD in English end up working in healthcare? So I'll go back in time a little bit. I started my PhD in 2009 with the same aspiration I think a lot of people starting a PhD in English have, which was to be an academic. But the further that I went into my PhD, the more I kind of second guessed that. And by my third year, I was like, pretty sure I didn't want to stay in academia. By the end of my PhD, I had also moved from Hamilton, where I was, living to attend McMaster University, back home to Thunder Bay, where I live now. And have lived since. And I was quite certain I never wanted to leave again, which is a bit of a challenge too if you want to do an academic career, because that, as many of us I think probably know, means going wherever the work is. And so when I completed my PhD in 2013, I worked for the first 3 years of my PhD as a sessional lecturer in women's and gender studies at Lakehead University. As well as part-time casual as a respite worker, providing personal support to disabled children and older adults. I liked some things about both of those things, but I really wanted and needed to find more stable employment, as anyone who's done sort of contract, part-time, casual work knows. Like, it can be kind of difficult when you don't know how much is on your next paycheck. So I really needed to find more stable employment. So I worked with a couple of different career coaches, both a sort of like, free publicly available services and also private career coach. And I started applying just about anywhere locally that I thought my skills might fit. With a focus on the nonprofit world, I'd also done some informational interviews with folks working in the nonprofit world. I'd thought, that might be best in alignment with my values, my desire for sort of a 9-to-5 situation, but also like work where I might kind of make a difference. And my first full-time position was a 1-year internship at John Howard Society of Thunder Bay. John Howard is actually a national organization with branches all over the place, and it supports reintegration of folks who've experienced incarceration, as well as other programs related to sort of mitigating harms of the justice system and alternatives to the mainstream justice system, etc. So in this internship, they were anticipating hiring someone with a college diploma, not a PhD, but they got someone with great writing and project management skills out of it. And I got job experience and connections in the nonprofit world. The position was fundraising, but the organization's small and everyone kind of wears multiple hats. So that meant, in addition to mainly what they hired me for, which was planning a gala ball fundraiser, as well as other smaller fundraising events, I applied successfully for a few grants on behalf of the organization. And I had a tiny bit of grant writing experience through my PhD. I had successfully applied for and gotten funding through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC, for my master's and my PhD. I also had worked on a SSHRC conference funding application as part of a conference that was held by the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster. So I was able to apply that and get some funding for John Howard Society and go a bit above and beyond that role that I had, as well as planning a very successful fundraising gala, which, got to tell you, event planning, I'm happy not to be in that as like my permanent gig, but it was a really beneficial experience to have done it. It really humbles you to like cold call people and ask them to sponsor your event, or donate raffle prizes or that sort of thing. So this experience actually at John Howard Society, didn't pay well. It was like a one-year internship, but combined with my academic background, it actually helped me to get my next job, which was at Lakehead University, which is one of my alma maters, where I did my undergraduate degree in English and Women's Studies. And my role there was, title was Research and Knowledge Mobilization Facilitator, and I stayed there for 4 years. And in that role, I wore a bunch of different hats. Although the title has knowledge mobilization in it, I didn't actually do all that much knowledge mobilization. The main thing that was the staple of my work was reviewing and providing feedback on research grant applications for researchers, faculty members at the university in arts, social sciences, humanities, and health research. I was also tasked with helping to increase research capacity for the university. So that included things like supporting partnership development in the nonprofit sector. There's a lot of grant opportunities now research grant opportunities that require research partners in the community. So some researchers have training in sort of developing partnerships and working in partnered approaches, and others don't. So I was partly helping to fill that gap. So I was doing like workshops on that, organizing panel discussions on that for faculty members who do that to share their wisdom with others. And I also, for example, organized a workshop with the Office of Indigenous Initiatives at Lakehead University on doing research in a good way with Indigenous partners. So some of these things also tied into equity work, which is what I do now, such as some of that stuff around Indigenous research. And I also, during my time in that role, towards the end of my time there, co-wrote a successful NSERC, which is the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council. So an NSERC, Institutional Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Capacity Building Grant. So this was a grant on behalf of the university to fund different initiatives within the university to help make the research world more equitable. We know there's a lot of inequities in sort of who gets grants and, folks who are doing community engaged approaches. There's a lot of barriers, can be a lot of barriers for folks in it takes longer. So things like publishing, your publishing trajectories are going to be different, or kind of where you're putting your energies might be a little bit different. So sort of revamping some of those things within the institution. So some funding to support that. So I had these experiences, and I wasn't really looking for work. I was reasonably happy there. I like getting to do a lot of different kinds of things in that role. It was a pretty stressful role because you're driven by grant deadlines. And faculty members, despite like always being really insistent that their students submit things on time, absolutely do not submit their grants on time on the whole. So, you know, you'd get something at like 7 p.m. and the absolute deadline for the grant's 8 p.m. and you're like quickly trying to review it and make sure people didn't forget anything, which they always have. So it was like a really like, you know, high pressure often during the peak grant seasons. But I did like it. I wasn't really looking for other work. Then along came an opportunity. It found me. An acquaintance that I met years ago on an advisory board for a research study. We were both part of the same community advisory board. Sent me a position for the job that I have now. They actually work in the same position, but in Sudbury. And they were wondering if I was interested. They thought I'd be a good fit, and they were like, you know, we're looking for someone in the Northwest to do this role. And I applied and I got the job. And, you know, it was sort of an interesting transition into the healthcare sector. And I kind of thought, I don't know if I'm going to be like qualified or if they're looking for someone with a background in English Lit. But there were pieces of equity work that I did in my role in research services, the partnership development work that I had done there to connect researchers with community partners. Also was applicable to this role where I do work with a lot of community partners. As well as my previous experience in the healthcare system as a respite worker. That also played in because, you know, I was asked about previous experience in the health system. And the other thing that played in was my PhD research. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute, but, you know, I did research in sort of the area of MAD studies, critical disability studies. I'll explain what that means in a minute if you don't know. And I also have lived experience as a person with experience as a mental health service user. So all of those things combined kind of helped me get this role, or I emphasized those things, you know, in my application and my interview, and how I could bring all of those pieces to working in a health equity role in the mental health system. So yeah, just in terms of educational journey, you know, like I said, I did an honors Bachelor of Arts in English and Women's Studies. That gave me some of the equity knowledge I use today. My master's and PhD. So like I said, was in English and Cultural Studies, but I worked in MAD studies, which if you're not familiar is kind of an interdisciplinary field. It comes out of the psychiatric survivor movement, and it's kind of grounded in critiquing the dominance of what we call like psi disciplines like psychiatry and psychology, and centering knowledge and perspectives of people who have experienced or are experiencing forms of mental distress or other, you know, sort of body-mind states that are labeled mental illness outside of medical paradigms. So my dissertation topic came out of my lived experiences as a psychiatric survivor. And in my dissertation, I, you know, sought to counter the medicalization of MAD characters and authors and kind of bring these intersectional MAD perspectives to literary studies. And as part of that, I did a blog project with other MAD folks and psychiatric survivors as part of my research. So I had like this little dabble into like community engaged approaches back in my dissertation research. Yeah, so just checking on time. What is our time today? When did we hope to start questions or kind of wrap up me talking at people?
We can start questions whenever you're ready.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just quickly highlight like some of the skill pieces. So, you know, what are some of the skills that I bring? I think I've already touched on some of those, but, you know, writing skills, I did not realize how rare strong writing skills are until really I left academia. those are kind of been a go-to skill set that's really been valued and I think helped me get a lot of the positions I've had. Facilitation and public speaking skills I've used in all of the positions I have now. The critical thinking and close reading skills, our main research method in literary studies is like carefully reading a text and looking for patterns and implied meanings. And I think often people say like, oh, you're just, reading a lot of books. But that close reading skills that I have are really useful when doing like literature reviews and then applying concepts from that to create things like equity frameworks and plans. And lastly, like project management skills. I think, although I didn't have a lot of project management skills when I started my PhD, it was kind of like, how the heck do I write a dissertation? Having that initial experience and then, managing other projects like doing event planning, that has really helped me, that has helped me like figure out how to conceptualize a project, how to set out what are all the pieces that need to be moved forward and kept on track, and being able to do that with sort of minimal supervision. I had excellent supervision in my PhD, but the kind of day-to-day, it's up to you to write that dissertation. So that was something that I learned writing my dissertation and I still do every day. So I will leave it there, and if folks have questions, please go ahead.
Okay, we have a small group here. It's Beth speaking from the Global Nexus. So if you just want to raise a hand or simply just call out a question for PhbeAnn, that's probably the best way forward. We have the call until 12:30. Can I just jump in and ask a quick question? I'm just interested, as a person who's done so many different things and now working within health equity, if there was a young person interested in moving in that direction in the career, how integral do you think the PhD piece of it was to working in that space?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I've sometimes had people say to me in my current job or my last job in researcher services, like, you really don't need a PhD to be doing what you're doing. And that's 100% true. I could do my current job without a PhD. I could do my last job without a PhD. And in the team I work in now, there are 2 other folks with PhDs, so we are not alone, but everyone else in my team has a master's degree. And we all have different backgrounds and different kinds of experience we came into the role with. But, I do think that my PhD gave me an opportunity to more thoughtfully hone a lot of skills and knowledge over a more extended period of time, to kind of deeply understand things like how social systems work. English and cultural studies, part of it is literature, but part of it is using literature as a vehicle or other kinds of texts, cultural texts as vehicles to understand sort of how systems work, how social systems work, how inequities are embedded into our everyday relations and the way we navigate through the world. So, as helpful as, an undergraduate education is, or even a master's education is, I came away with this really deep level of analysis from doing my PhD, and I use that as a value add in both my work and my life. And I also have a comfort with things like facilitation. I taught in a university. Teaching intro women's and gender studies, not that different from teaching like health equity trainings or facilitating health equity trainings. In fact, similar concepts like intersectionality or, talking about systemic racism, those sorts of things are, I kind of know that like the back of my hand.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
I have one question. So I'm a PhD student currently at McMaster doing a PhD in engineering. So my question was, I was just wondering, in your current role, do you still publish papers or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Mostly no. You know, I'm pretty busy with my other day-to-day stuff. Certainly, there are many folks who continue after if they go into a non-academic career or like an alt-ac career, as is sometimes said, like alternative academic career. Do continue as independent scholars. There are some opportunities within my program. I actually just submitted a paper with a colleague last year around sort of language issues and how in the equity, diversity, and inclusion sphere. Like I was joking about earlier, we love our acronyms and we love our buzzwords, but sort of thinking about, you know, where the language comes from we're using, why we choose the language that we choose in this sphere, you know, how these terms get taken up. We wrote kind of a paper exploring that and have submitted that. So sometimes I do find time on the side to do some of that, but it's not in the particular role that I'm in, there's no requirement or expectation to publish, and it's certainly like a off the side of your desk kind of thing. But folks do sometimes publish if there's, you know, evaluation. There's a lot of evaluation in the program I work with. So people do publish in things like journals around evaluation science. And there are actually research positions within the program that I work in. So those folks are going to be publishing a lot more. So that's the other thing. There are research-based positions outside of academia.
Thank you.
PhebeAnn, if I may jump in again, can you speak more about, you mentioned alt academic careers. That's super interesting. Could you talk a bit more about that avenue?
Yeah, so that's not my term. I don't even know who like originally coined that, but certainly something that you know, has circulated as a term. So alt-ac meaning kind of careers in academia or sort of academic adjacent institutions, which both my last job in a university and research services and my current job in a academic hospital would be kind of alt-ac in the sense that they are, you know, roles in academic environments that draw on academic skills but are non-teaching, non-research based positions, or like I don't even know if they have to be non-research or teaching, but like certainly not faculty positions, which is like, you know, what many people are originally sort of moving towards as an academic position. So, you know, it might be worth noting on the previous question I got too, like in my previous role in research services, it was actually specified that, you know, we weren't to be applying for research grants. There was kind of a conflict there because we were supporting, not only did we very much not have time, but we also were, you know, our roles were very explicitly not research roles. We were supporting the research, development of the research programs of other researchers, but not doing the research. That said, you know, in that role, because of my intensive involvement in establishing some research partnerships that then were successfully funded through federal grants, I actually had faculty members that I worked closely with on 2 different grants ask me to be a collaborator on their short grants. So collaborator is a bit more of like a loose role. So as a way of recognizing my contributions, the way that I help to support the establishment of the partnership, and in many ways, sometimes with some of those partnerships, established them on an or supported them on an ongoing basis to help them apply for future funding. And sort of the closer I was to the researchers' work and knew what they were doing, knew what they were publishing, knew where they were hoping to go with the research in future, I could keep my eye out for appropriate grant opportunities. And also, like, I knew their work, so when I was helping them write their grants or revise their grants, you know, I had that sort of knowledge already in mind that I could insert and, you know, give them the best chance of being successful with their applications.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to ask a sort of follow-up question, going back to something you said, PhbeAnn, about the experience of working on your PhD and things you got involved in when you were a doctoral student. And I wondered what advice you have for students currently working on their dissertations and trying to juggle, like, focusing on that really important research project and getting through the degree in a timely way and engaging in professional development activities. And just that balance, there's, you know, so many things people can potentially get involved in, and it can be tricky to figure out like which things are, you know, going to be like the most valuable and helpful. So that question of juggling, I guess, during the PhD is one I thought maybe would be helpful.
Yeah, so like I feel like that's a daunting challenge all the time, is what is the right balance. And I certainly would not claim that the way that I did it would be the right way for everyone. I think it depends on your goals. So initially, kind of in my PhD, I was like, you know, I think there's a lot of pressure. You know how high the stakes are if you are planning to go into academia. The job market is tight. There's limited opportunities, and you want to stand out from the crowd. So you're like trying to put anything and everything onto your CV. So you're trying to publish, and you're trying to sit on committees, and you're trying to go to conferences. And, you know, there's increasingly that expectation to kind of be a public intellectual too, you know, and I don't know, have a TikTok or something where you explain your ideas in a funny way. And all those things are great. I think I'm probably not the best person to be like, to know exactly for each person's field, like where they should focus. I would say talk to your supervisor about that. If publications in certain kind of journals are what's going to get you hired and that's your goal, probably like focusing more of your energies there. But for me, you know, the first year or two, I was like just throwing everything at the wall, like being on every committee that I was asked to be on, and trying to publish papers and trying to finish my dissertation. I got really overwhelmed and I got really anxious, and I fell into a depression, especially as someone, you know, with pre-existing mental health challenges too. Like that was you know, stressful for me. So it was like too many things. And I realized I got to pick and choose the things. And I also have to have a life, because I am also a person outside of academia, and I have other passions besides this project. And I needed more balance. That was part of the reason I moved home. And I also realized I don't think I'm going to stay in academia. So I chose to put my energy toward completing my dissertation in a timely fashion. And I didn't focus so much on publishing. I didn't focus so much on going to conferences. I got a lot more choosy about which of those types of things that I did. I finished my dissertation quite quickly. Like I finished my PhD in 4 years, but I made choices, right? I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but I made that choice for me, because I was like, finishing is what's more important to me, because I'm probably not going to go into academia. So like spending a lot of my time on publishing and that kind of thing is like probably not going to serve me really, really well. I spent more time on like getting to know my community again, getting into like kind of community organizing. And I think that did benefit me just in like making connections in my community. So yeah, depends what your goal is, and the goal can also shift, and that's okay.
PhebeAnn, what kind of advice would you give for people who are currently, just when you're talking about shift and pivoting, for people, you know, pursuing their PhD and they're starting to get that same feeling you had in terms of academia might not be for me? What sort of advice would you give to those folks in terms of next steps or working through that challenge?
Yeah. So I think, like, I would like to start with a reassurance to folks. Like, I remember when I started doubting, like, oh, I don't think I want to stay in academia. I thought, gee, like, where am I going to go? Like, where, you know, where am I going to take this PhD in English? And, you know, where am I going to find meaningful work? Where am I going to, you know, all those questions. And I actually, I want to share a memory. I'll share a little vulnerable memory that I was at like a party of fellow graduate students, and everybody was talking about, you know, some folks were talking about like applying to jobs, or folks were talking about, you know, different publications they were submitting or all of these things. And I just like, I felt really like at odds with like, oh, and you know, here's me and I don't even think I'm going to stay here and what am I going to do? And I'm like, there's nowhere for me to go. And I remember I like went and hid and cried in the bathroom. I was like, you know, there's nowhere else to go, but there are lots of places to go, and there are lots of places that will value your skills. And I, you know, I kind of had to figure that out. I didn't really know when I started out. I think one thing that helped me was like the informational interviews I did. That's a great technique. So if folks aren't familiar with that, it's basically like starting to look around at, you know, what are other people with your type of degree maybe doing? I did that when I was finishing up. I don't know if people know Jennifer Polk. She has a blog called From PhD to Life.
Yes.
And she's also like kind of a career coach, but she was just sort of starting up her business at the time that I was finishing. And she had this blog of like people talking about where they ended up with their PhDs. And I started reading that and going like, okay, here's somebody with a history degree, or here's somebody with an English degree and what they did. And, you know, I also, you know, was working with a therapist around the same time and talking about career. That's not a bad thing to do. You know, I think it comes with a grieving process too. If you thought you were going to stay in academia and now you realize maybe this isn't the dream I want to pursue, processing the feelings around that too is an important step. But I started doing these informational interviews with folks that I was able to get connected to who were working at nonprofits here in Thunder Bay. I made some of those connections by volunteering for the United Way, doing some communications work for them. So I did a series of interviews around their community impact projects that their communications person just didn't have capacity to work on. And I kind of showed up and just pitched myself and said, hey, I want to do some writing. Is there some writing I can do for you? I knew the United Way was connected to like lots of different nonprofits in the city and provided funding to them. So that was like a great avenue to get connected to people that I did informational interviews with. And, you know, I didn't end up staying, like, I guess I do work for a nonprofit. A hospital is a nonprofit, but it's like a large, large nonprofit that also, again, has academic ties. But that first job in the nonprofit world, I think, I got a sense of like what nonprofits are looking for, how to structure my resume, that sort of thing through some of those, as well as the career coaching that I took part in. So like any of those things to sort of just explore, and like knowing the first job you get out of your PhD doesn't have to be your final job either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've all had those crying in the bathroom moments. So thanks for sharing that. And it's not the end, it's just the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. I'm seeing a question in the chat. Do you have any tips on how you can market yourself who may not necessarily see value from reading your resume? Well, I got to tell you, I ate some humble pie when I first came out of my PhD. I had a CV and like working to translate my academic CV where I had my publications listed and conference presentations and all these TA-ships I'd done and stuff. And the most valuable place that I worked with was actually just a career center, like publicly funded career center in my town. That I went to, and the person who coached me, you know, like I don't think really worked with many PhDs, but she looked at my resume and she said, this is way too academia land. I remember her saying that. And you know, she really helped me to take a lot of things off of there because they're not meaningful outside of academia. Like academia is like a little bit tunnel vision. And the things that are meaningful in academia may not be meaningful in some of the jobs that you're applying to. It depends on the job. So look closely at that job application, or that job description. You know, those long descriptions, go through with a highlighter, look for things like, yes, I have this skill. Here's how I can demonstrate this skill. Think of it the same way you would write a paper. Here's what they're asking for. Here's my evidence of where I have done that. Give specific examples of where you've done that thing. And that can be inside academia, that can be in volunteer work, that can be, you know, in other jobs that you've done, even in the far past, like a summer job you've done. Draw on all of the different skills you have. So I would say people who don't, see the value, you've got to partly rewrite to the way that they are going to understand. I think we think like we're like, we've been trained a certain way in academia and it doesn't necessarily translate outside. So having somebody read it who's outside academia, using the language they use in the description, So I said I was writing this paper with a colleague on the language we use in the EDI sphere. So, I came of age in my university career talking about things like oppression, right? Whereas in the EDI sphere, they say equity seeking groups or equity deserving groups, which like I kind of hate all this language, and I prefer like stronger kind of social justice oriented language. But if you're applying for a grant or you're applying for a job and that's the language they're using in their description, that's the language you should use in your application. And you can always tweak it later when you're in the job, and you can like sneakily be like, maybe we should use different language, or you can bring in those critical perspectives once you've got the job. But and I was clear in the role I have now that I have critical perspectives on the mental health system, and that's like part of what they were looking for. So I'm not saying like totally compromise your values here or anything, but like try to meet them where they're at in their world, in their sector, and the language that they use.
Okay, I do have another question. So many folks go into, for example, a PhD in English and literature with a view to the only way through is academia, becoming a professor. But could you share some of the really surprising, powerful ways that going in a different direction, some of the surprising ways that you found great meaning in the work you're doing now that maybe you didn't expect when you had a plan to go to academia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that meaning is a tricky thing. It depends on the day whether I find the work meaningful. I'm going to be honest on that. It can be really frustrating, especially working in the EDI sphere, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because regardless of what in big institution you're doing that in, there tend to be the same challenges, which is that those institutions are like pretty resistant to change and often like have their way of doing things, and they only want to make like really small changes and not like structural changes. And so like you're constantly kind of having to find the wiggle room, figure out where you can push back. I've been able to bring a lot of work from feminist philosopher Sarah Ahmed into my work, who I first learned of in my PhD research, but she writes on equity, diversity, inclusion work quite a bit, and is really on the nose. So, when I get those small wins, I find that meaningful. When I'm able to change somebody's mind about something, I find that meaningful. When I'm able to shift like a one-off engagement effort to like, maybe we can actually hire someone with lived experience, or maybe we can give someone a more meaningful opportunity to take ownership of this work, that feels meaningful. But there are a lot of days of frustration as well, I think, in the role. So I also, I think a place that I do find meaning, aside from like, am I achieving better equity in the health system? Single-handedly, no, I'm not doing that. I think one thing is I work with incredible people. As I mentioned, I have colleagues. All my colleagues are very highly educated. They're also educated in many different fields. So I work with people with backgrounds in social work, in public health, in health humanities, in what else do we have? Education, nursing, psychology. So all these different disciplines. And one thing about like when you work like in academia, yes, you can have like colleagues in other departments, but you get sometimes, I think, kind of stuck in your methodologies and kind of, working in an area for a long time, especially early in your career. And I get to kind of dabble in a lot of different methodologies. I've gotten to learn about program evaluation, which is not something that I really knew anything about going into this role. So I like get to learn new things. I get to work with people from a lot of backgrounds and learn from their, educational backgrounds and different perspectives. And working in EDI too, you often get to work with like a much more diverse team in terms of, sort of cultural background, educational background, that sort of thing, than maybe a lot of places. So I really value that and like that a lot about my team, and just working with people with similar values, and like having a really strong collegial culture in my work are like all things that I do find a lot of meaning from as well.
Thank you. Okay, were there any other questions? Okay. Well, if there aren't, is there anything else you'd like to add, PhebeAnn?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would add is sometimes people ask me, do you regret doing a PhD? Because again, like I don't technically need my PhD to do a lot of the roles that I've done. Potentially could have gotten them with a master's and job experience, that sort of thing. But I 100% don't regret it, both because of that, deeper learning and analysis that I apply to all of the roles that I've done and in my life. I still have a rich intellectual life, also outside my job. And that doesn't end just because you take the person out of academia. Academia is still kind of in the person, I think. But I also got to work on a project I was passionate about for 4 years. I was really fortunate to be funded, so I basically got paid to do something that I was really passionate about, a project of my own, conceiving, and to really thoughtfully think and learn and hone my skills and do that with other passionate people doing interesting things, over 4 years. I wouldn't take that back. Absolutely not. Like, it's an absolute privilege to be able to do a PhD. I think thinking through some of those questions, like the financial questions, what's your backup plan if academia, either you choose that it's not your role or it doesn't pan out for you, because it sometimes, no matter how hard you publish and try to put yourself out there, the role's just not there. And so sort of thinking through your different options, as you're going in is probably a really great plan to have sort of in place, some of those thoughts, and that can continue to evolve as well. But I don't regret it. I'm happy to be Dr. Wolframe-Smith, and great gender neutral title too, and to carry that experience with me.
Wonderful. Well, it's if there's not any other questions, I guess we can move on. So it's just been a huge pleasure, PhebeAnn. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just, you had actually some really high level, really inspirational thoughts to share, but also some really tactical things I think people can take away in terms of the informational interviews and that sort of thing. So it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you. So I thank you for sharing your experiences, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. It's wonderful to know that everybody's everybody's jumping in on the chat there now. Loving to hear your perspective. So thanks for joining us. And there isn't one next week, but we'll have another webinar the following week. So hopefully we'll see you back here again.